Welcome back. Find a comfortable position and let the day begin to fall away. In the hush of evening, we'll drift through the ancient love story of Inanna and the fate of Dumuzi. If this quiets your mind, subscribe, and there's always another waiting tomorrow night. In the spring of 1889, in the dry plains of southern Iraq, a team of excavators working for the University of Pennsylvania broke through the surface of a low mound and found themselves in the oldest scribal city in the world. The ground at Nippur was the color of pale dust. It had not rained in weeks. The air carried the particular mineral smell of very old, very dry soil, the kind of smell that belongs to places where things have been buried a long time, and the heat has had centuries to work on them. The tools scraped and tapped against the earth, and then, at a particular depth, a particular angle, a corner appeared in the soil that was too precise to be natural. A right angle, the edge of something made. What came out of that earth, over the months and years that followed, was not gold, it was not carved stone or painted wood or any of the materials that survive in museums looking beautiful. What came out was clay, tablets of dried and fired clay, most of them the size of a human hand, some smaller, a few larger, their surfaces pressed all over with small wedge-shaped marks arranged in careful rows. Cuneiform script, the writing system of ancient Sumer, invented in this same region more than 1,000 years before these particular tablets were made, pressed into wet clay with a cut reed stylus, and then dried or fired so the marks would hold. Thousands of tablets came out of Nippur. Many were broken, many were split across what had once been a single surface, many were missing pieces that were presumably still somewhere in the earth or already turned to dust, or lying unrecognized in some other part of the mound that had not yet been reached. The excavators numbered them, they wrapped them, they packed them into crates, and eventually those crates were shipped, and eventually those tablets came to rest on shelves in museums, in Philadelphia, in Istanbul, in Chicago, where they sat in labeled drawers and waited to be read. This is where the story of Inanna and Dumuzi begins, in one practical sense, not in the mythological time when the gods were young and the world was newly made, but in the late 19th century, in a trench in southern Iraq, with a team of workers and a cloud of pale dust, and the first careful emergence of clay tablets from soil that had not been disturbed in 4,000 years. The myths themselves are considerably older than their moment of recovery, but recovery has its own history, and that history is specific, and it matters, because without it, the words pressed into those tablets would still be lying in the earth, unknown. The city of Nippur, in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, held a particular place in the religious and intellectual life of ancient Sumer. It was not the political capital. Power moved between cities in Mesopotamia, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, and Nippur, was not always the seat of a ruling dynasty. What it was, with a consistency that lasted across centuries of political change, was the city of the god Enlil, the lord of wind and air, and the sacred center of the Sumerian scribal tradition. The schools where young scribes learned to write were among the most important institutions Nippur contained. In those schools, buildings of mud brick, probably roofed with something that let in the cooler air of early morning, students sat with soft clay tablets and practiced, decopied texts. They pressed the wedge marks of the cuneiform script over and over into fresh surfaces until the shapes became automatic, until the hand knew how to make them without the mind needing to labor over each one. And among the texts they copied were love songs. A scribal student in Nippur, learning to write by copying a love poem, is one of the stranger and quieter images that the recovery of these tablets makes available. The student was probably young. The clay was probably cool in the morning when it was freshest and easiest to work. The reed stylus was cut at an angle so that when pressed into the clay, it made the characteristic wedge shape, broad at the top, tapering to a point that gives cuneiform its name, and the words being pressed into that surface were the words of Inanna, speaking about Dumuzi, or Dumuzi's voice describing what he wanted to bring to the goddess, or the back and forth refrain of a song that lament priests had sung in temples long before any scribe first committed it to clay. The student copied these words as a practice exercise. The tablet dried. Thousands of years passed. Someone dug it out of the ground in Nippur and shipped it to Philadelphia. The cuneiform tablets that preserve the Inanna Dumuzi mythology were primarily written down during the period scholars call the Third Dynasty of Ur, a time of political consolidation and extraordinary literary production that flourished between approximately 2112 and 2004 BCE. This is roughly 4,000 years ago. The dynasty and the city that gave it its name sat in the same flat, river-defined landscape as Nippur, and the kings of that period were deeply invested in the relationship between royal legitimacy and the gods, including Inanna. The scribal schools of that era produced texts in large quantities: love songs, hymns, myths, lament texts, royal proclamations. All of them went onto clay. The tablets that came out of Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania's excavations were largely products of this scribal culture, though they recorded traditions considerably older than the schools that copied them. The myths of Inanna and Dumuzi are not Third Dynasty inventions. The stories are older than any written form they took. Evidence for this lives inside the texts themselves, in their structure and their sounds. The love poems include refrains, phrases that repeat at regular intervals, the same words returning like a wave pattern through a longer song. They include call and response patterns, in which one voice poses something and another voice answers, the form implying not a single reciting reader, but a group of performers in dialogue. They include formulaic epithets, fixed phrases attached to specific figures, the kind of language that develops when a story is told and retold aloud, so many times that certain descriptions become attached to certain figures, the way a hook attaches to a melody, so that the audience knows before the phrase is complete how it will end. These are features of oral composition. They are the fingerprints of a tradition that lived in performance, in the voices of temple singers, in the recitations of lament priests, in the call and response of ritual ceremonies, long before anyone decided to press it into clay and preserve it that way. Lament priests in Sumerian temples were a specific professional class. Their role was to sing laments, songs of mourning, songs that marked the rhythms of the religious year, songs that accompanied the seasonal disappearance of the god Dumuzi into the underworld and celebrated his return. These were not informal performances. The priests were trained. The texts were standardized enough that singers across different cities could share them, that the same refrain might be performed in Nippur and in Uruk without significant variation. The rhythms were set. The refrains were fixed. When the moment came in the ceremony to repeat the phrase, the priests repeated the phrase, and audiences knew it was coming, and the repetition was part of what the ceremony was doing, part of how it worked on the listeners gathered in the temple courtyard or the inner sanctum, letting the words and rhythms settle into the body, the way repeated sound always eventually does. These performances, repeated across generations, were eventually what the scribes of the Third Dynasty and their successors wrote down. What the tablets preserve is not simply a story, but the residue of a performing tradition compressed into clay dried, and then waiting in the earth for a long time. The excavations at Nippur lasted in their primary phase from 1889 to 1900, though the University of Pennsylvania conducted additional campaigns in later years. The material recovered was immense, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets and fragments, representing the accumulated textual wealth of what had been a working scribal city. The problem with immense quantities of material is that it does not organize itself. The tablets went into museum collections, and the collections were stored, and scholars began the work of identifying, cataloging, reading, and interpreting. But the tablets had not arrived in Nippur already sorted. They had been found in buildings and courtyards, and waste heaps and storerooms, broken into pieces by the weight of what lay on top of them across the centuries, mixed together by the movement of soil and water and the disturbances of earlier human activity at the site. A tablet that had once been a single surface might now be 3 fragments in 3 different drawers. A love poem that had once been one complete text might now be 2 pieces, one in Philadelphia and one in Istanbul, their broken edges waiting across an ocean for someone to hold them together. This is where Samuel Noah Kramer enters the story. Kramer was born in 1897 in what is now Ukraine, and came eventually to the University of Pennsylvania's museum, where he spent the largest portion of his professional life working on Sumerian cuneiform. He was, among other things, a traveler, not in the metaphorical sense, but in the literal sense of someone who boarded ships and trains and made his way between the museums of the world to sit with their tablet collections and read them. The tablets were in Philadelphia. They were also in Istanbul, at the archaeological museums there, where Ottoman-era agreements had directed a share of the Nippur excavation materials. They were in Chicago, at the Oriental Institute. They were in Baghdad. And so Kramer went to these places, not once but repeatedly, across a career that stretched across much of the 20th century, carrying his knowledge of Sumerian cuneiform from collection to collection, reading what was in each drawer, and looking, among other things, for pieces that fit. Joining tablet fragments is a specific physical activity. 2 pieces of clay, broken apart at some moment thousands of years ago, have edges. If both pieces are present and have not been further damaged since their separation, those edges will fit together the way the edges of any broken object fit. The break surface will align, the cuneiform signs will continue from one fragment to the other without interruption, and what had been an incomplete or puzzling text will suddenly extend. Kramer found such joins in museum storerooms. In the low light of workrooms, he would hold a fragment from one collection up against his knowledge of what a fragment in another collection contained, and recognize the connection, recognize that the line which ended abruptly in Istanbul continued in Philadelphia, that the refrain that seemed to begin mid-phrase in Chicago made sense if you knew what was on a tablet in Baghdad. He held the pieces up, one account of his working method suggests, against the light to see the break surfaces clearly, to confirm that the edges matched and the signs lined up. And when they did, a text that no one had read in 4,000 years became, for the first time, longer. This is not a description of tragedy. The fragmentation of the Nippur tablets is not a loss in the way a fire is a loss, or a deliberate destruction is a loss. It is rather a condition of material survival, the way that clay behaves over time, the way that excavation disturbs what was buried, the way that institutional collections are built from the circumstances that created them. The tablets that survived at all survived because clay is durable, because the Nippur earth is dry, because enough was deposited in enough places that the accumulated distribution of fragments across multiple collections still contained, among them all, most of what had originally been written. Kramer's joins were discoveries, not recoveries of something stolen. The texts were not gone, they were distributed, and Kramer, traveling between collections over decades, had the patience and the knowledge to see across the distribution. The Istanbul archaeological museums hold a significant portion of the Nippur tablet collection. A visitor to those storerooms, if such a visit were possible, would find labeled trays on shelves, clay tablets organized by accession number, their cuneiform surfaces turned up to the light that comes through the workroom windows. Some of these tablets describe the same passages as tablets on shelves in Philadelphia. The scribes who made them were different people. The specific tablets were produced in the same century, in the same scribal tradition, by hands that knew the same set of texts. Two different copies of the same poem, separated by excavation and then by institutional geography, sitting in different cities on different continents, each preserving its portion of what the Sumerian scribal tradition thought worth teaching students to copy. This is not disorder. This is, in its way, the normal condition of ancient textual survival, distributed, partial, recoverable through attention and time. The specific category of tablet that concerns this particular story includes the love poetry of Inanna and Dumuzi, the sacred marriage texts, and the group of texts sometimes called the Dumuzi dream texts, or collected under the title The Death of Dumuzi. These last are a distinct body of cuneiform literature, separate from the main text usually called the Descent of Inanna, which describes the goddess's journey into the underworld. The story of what happens to Dumuzi after Inanna's return, his condemnation, his flight, his transformation, the role of his sister Inanna, and the resolution that divides the year between them, is preserved in its own tablet group, with its own textual history and its own pattern of fragments and joins and scholarly reconstruction. The two bodies of text, the Descent on one side, the Dumuzi dream group on the other, illuminate each other. They are not duplicates. They are, in a sense, companion documents, each carrying part of a story that the other requires to be complete. The reed stylus that a Sumerian scribe used to press cuneiform into clay was a very ordinary object. It was cut from the marsh reeds that grew along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, the same rivers that defined the geography of everything that happened in this region for thousands of years. The cutting was done at an angle, producing the wedge-shaped end that made the characteristic mark. A fresh tablet of clay, prepared that morning, smoothed by hand, slightly damp, would hold the impression clearly. Too dry and the marks crumbled at their edges. Too wet and they blurred. The scribe knew, by experience, the right moment to press, and into this narrow window of material readiness, in a scribal school in Nippur, a student pressed the words of a love poem, the voice of Inanna describing Dumuzi, or the voice of Dumuzi calling to Inanna, or the refrain that the lament priests had sung for generations before anyone wrote it down. There is something quietly remarkable about the physical chain that connects a Sumerian scribal student in Nippur 4,000 years ago to a reader in the 21st century. The student pressed marks into clay. The clay dried. A building collapsed on top of it. Soil accumulated over the building. 4,000 years of Mesopotamian weather and the slow movements of the earth pressed down on the soil. Then, in 1889, workers dug through that soil for the University of Pennsylvania, and the tablet came up, its wedge marks still pressed clean, still sharp at their edges, the words still there, in the same form the student pressed them. Then the tablet traveled to a museum. Then a scholar with the patience to read cuneiform read it. Then, eventually, it became part of a body of translated and interpreted material that took readable form in English. The most significant accessible collection of the Inanna Dumuzi material available in English is a book published in 1983 called Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth. It was co-authored by Diane Walkstein, who brought the materials into literary English, and Samuel Noah Kramer, who provided the scholarship, the translations, the textual notes, the reconstructions built from decades of reading, cuneiform, across the museum collections of the world. The book's spine carries both names. It sits in libraries with the same quiet presence as any other book, unremarkable in its physical form, its pages holding words that were once pressed into clay in Nippur by hands that have been dust for 4,000 years. Walkstein and Kramer. The names are printed on the cover in the ordinary way that names are printed on books. Nothing about the object announces what is inside it, that it is the result of Kramer's decades of transatlantic travel, of the joining of fragments held on different continents, of the University of Pennsylvania's excavations in the Nippur earth, of a scribal tradition that copied love songs as practice exercises in schools built of mud brick in a city that has been underground for 2 millennia. The Nippur Mound is still there. It sits in what is now the Nippur region of Iraq, south of Baghdad, in the same flat landscape it occupied when Enlil's temple rose above it, and students sat in the scribal schools copying texts. Excavations have continued at various points across the 20th and 21st centuries, though access to the site has been complicated by political circumstances for much of that period. The tablets that came out in the great University of Pennsylvania campaigns of the 1890s remain where they arrived, in Philadelphia, in Istanbul, in Chicago, in their labeled drawers, in their museum collections, their cuneiform surfaces holding the same marks they held when they came out of the earth. When Kramer and Walkstein's book was published, the texts it presented had already been partially known to scholars for decades. Kramer himself had published translations and interpretations in academic contexts across his long career. But 1983 was the moment these materials became widely accessible, the moment someone could take them off a library shelf without needing to read cuneiform or visit a museum storeroom, without needing to know which fragment was in Istanbul and which was in Chicago, and how Kramer had determined they fit together. The work of recovery and reconstruction, patient and specific and distributed across institutions and decades, had produced something that could sit on an ordinary shelf in an ordinary library and be opened and be read. There is a detail about the 1983 book that is easy to pass over. It has 2 names on the spine. Not 1, 2. The pairing is itself a record of how the Inanna Dumuzi material moved from cuneiform to English, through the collaboration of a Sumerologist who had spent his career reading tablets in museum storerooms, and a writer who understood how to carry ancient poetry into a language that didn't exist when the poetry was first sung. Each task required a different set of skills. Each name on the spine represents a different portion of the long chain between the scribal school in Nippur and a reader in the 21st century. The chain involved many more people than 2, the excavators in 1889, the museum workers who crated and shipped the tablets, the curators who cataloged them, the scholars who read earlier versions and published earlier translations, the institutions that funded the work across a century. But the book on the shelf has 2 names, and those 2 names are where the material arrived, in the form in which it is most accessible, after its very long journey from the earth. The scribal schools of Nippur were not libraries in the modern sense, though they held texts. They were training institutions, places where knowledge was preserved by being transmitted, where the preservation happened through the act of a student pressing their stylus into clay and copying what the teacher set before them. A love poem survived because students copied it, because copying it was considered an appropriate exercise for a developing scribe. There may not have been anything more deliberate than that in the preservation decision, nothing analogous to a curator choosing to archive a particular document because of its cultural significance. The love poems were copied because they were good exercises, because their rhythms and refrains and call and response structures gave students the kind of varied, repetitive practice that pressed the forms of cuneiform into muscle memory. And in being good exercises, they became surviving texts. The school produced its copies. The copies went into the world. Some were used, consulted, recited. Eventually they were discarded or stored or simply left in a building that eventually fell. The earth covered the building. Nippur accumulated its layers. And 4,000 years later, the tablets came up. What came up were love songs. Among the oldest surviving literature in any language, pressed into clay by hands learning to write in a scribal school in a city that is now a mound in the Iraqi plain. They describe a goddess and a shepherd. They use the word for honey in relation to lips and hands. They carry, even across the long translation from Sumerian through scholarly interpretation and then into English, the specific warmth of language meant to describe affection, particular, physical, directed at a specific figure in a specific mythological world. The tablets were not damaged enough to obscure this. The wedge marks held, and so the words held with them, waiting in the earth for Nippur to be dug, and the tablets to be shipped, and the museum drawers to be opened, and Kramer's patient, traveling attention to find across fragments and institutions and decades what the scribal students of the Third Dynasty had pressed into clay, a story about a goddess, a shepherd, and what passed between them, older than the writing that first preserved it, and older still than anyone now knows how to trace. The book, published in 1983, sits on a library shelf in the ordinary way that books sit on shelves. Its spine holds the names Wolkstein and Kramer. Its pages hold translations of texts that were pressed into clay in Nippur 4,000 years ago by students who were learning to write by copying love songs in schools that taught by repetition, in a city that the earth eventually covered, in a landscape that the University of Pennsylvania's excavators reached in 1889 and that Samuel Noah Kramer kept returning to across the decades of his career, in the physical form of museum storerooms, in the specific form of tablet fragments held up to the light, in the patient transatlantic form of a scholar who knew that the piece that would complete the line was probably in a different drawer, in a different city, waiting. Wolkstein and Kramer, two names on a spine, the ancient words carried forward by specific, patient, named human beings, resting now in a book anyone can open and read. On the roof of a temple in ancient Uruk, in the hour before the sky has properly decided to become day, a single point of light appears on the eastern horizon. The darkness is still thick in the west. The flat Mesopotamian plain below stretches out in every direction, without feature, without interruption, the land so level that the eye travels for miles before finding anything to stop it. And then, on the rim where the dark earth meets the slightly less dark sky, a star arrives, not gradually, not as a slow brightening of the horizon. It arrives as a point, sharp and complete, brighter than anything else in the visible sky, bright enough that someone standing on that temple roof, watching carefully, might just catch the faint shadow it casts at their feet. This was Venus. This was Inanna. The observation was not casual. The temple astronomer who stood on that roof kept records. There were clay registers, columns of wedge marks noting the precise moments of the planet's appearance and disappearance, its behavior tracked across months and years with the kind of sustained attention that only comes when something is understood to matter absolutely. And Venus did matter absolutely, because in the religious understanding of ancient Sumer, the planet and the goddess were not symbols of one another, they were one another. What the planet did in the sky, the goddess did in the world. When Venus disappeared from the evening sky and went dark for a period before reappearing in the east as the morning star, that was Inanna descending and returning. The sky was not a metaphor for the divine. The sky was where divinity was legible. Inanna's connection to this planet was already old by the time the scribes of the third dynasty of Ur set it down in clay. The city of Uruk, one of the largest and earliest cities the world had yet seen, its mud brick walls rising from the flat southern Mesopotamian plain, had been Inanna's city since before the written record begins. The Inanna Temple precinct, whose name means House of Heaven, stood at the city's center on a raised platform of compacted earth and mud brick, its white plastered walls visible at a distance across the flat surrounding land. In the morning, when the light came in low from the east, those walls caught it and held it, bright against the plain. Inanna had been worshipped there, in some form, since the Uruk period, since approximately the years between 3500 and 3000 BCE, which means her worship predates the great cuneiform literary tradition that would eventually describe her, predates the love songs, predates the hymns, and reaches back into a time before writing could say anything about what it was people felt when they stood in her courtyard and looked up at her. The written record, when it arrives, is already rich with her. Inanna is not a minor figure in the Sumerian pantheon. She is not a specialist deity with a single domain. The lists of her attributes that appear in the oldest cuneiform sources describe a figure of extraordinary scope, one who held in her domain things that in any other mythological system would have been distributed across several separate deities. She was associated with love and desire, with war and the violence of battle, with abundance and the stored grain in the temple storerooms, with the planet Venus in both its morning and evening aspects, with the office of kingship, with the power to overturn what had been settled. She was called the Queen of Heaven. She was called the first daughter of the moon. She was called the one who knows how to move between what is above and what is below. Each of these was not a poetic exaggeration, but a statement of theological fact, carefully held by the people who composed her hymns and maintained her temple. The earliest named author in the surviving written record is a woman who spent her life in Inanna's service. Enheduanna, whose name means something close to ornament of heaven, lived approximately between 2285 and 2250 BCE. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the ruler whose empire stretched across Mesopotamia in the late 3rd millennium, and she served as high priestess at the temple of the moon god Nanna in the city of Ur. In that role, she composed hymns to Inanna that survive in cuneiform on tablets that scribes continued to copy for centuries after her death, which is itself a kind of evidence about how her words were received. The hymns are not mild devotional verses. They are sustained, detailed, intense. They argue for Inanna's greatness across many lines. They list her powers. They address her directly in a voice that is neither distant nor purely ceremonial, but something more personal than that. One of them, a text known by its opening words as Nin Mashara, has been described by scholars as a lament, a praise song, and a theological argument all at once. Whatever it is among the oldest surviving literary works attributed to a specific named human being, and the name belongs to a woman pressing a reed stylus into clay in the city of Ur around 4,200 years ago. What Inanna was cataloging in her hymns, what the scribes of Nippur were copying in their practice exercises, what the lament priests were reciting in the temple courtyards, was a goddess whose particular character had been worked out in careful, serious detail over a very long period. To understand Inanna fully, the Sumerian religious tradition developed a theological concept called the me. The word does not translate cleanly into any modern language, which is itself informative about how specifically Sumerian the idea is. The me pronounced something close to may referred to the fundamental laws and institutions of civilized existence, each one understood as a concrete divine object rather than an abstract principle. Kingship was a me, priesthood was a me, the smith's art was a me. The art of music, the drum, the lyre, the reed pipe was a me, descent into the underworld was a me, the scribal arts were a me. Each of these was not merely a human institution that happened to have divine approval. Each was a divine thing, a discrete object with substance that could be held in the hands, transferred between gods, carried on a boat, gained or lost. A scribe inscribing a list of the me onto a tablet in the scribal schools of Nippur would have pressed dozens of entries into the clay. The list in the texts that survive includes over 100 items, ranging from the great offices of civilization down to specific emotional and social states, including the descent into the underworld and the ascent from it, which were understood as part of the fabric of reality, not as exceptional events but as structural features of the world that divinity needed to govern and maintain. The mere were, in this sense, the architecture of civilization itself, each piece of the architecture understood as a divine possession rather than a human invention. And Inanna, in the myth that describes one of her most characteristic acts, acquires as many of them as she can. The myth is sometimes called Inanna and Enki. Enki, the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of the deep underground aquifer the Sumerians called the Abzu, lived in the city of Eridu, the oldest of the Sumerian cities, at the far southern end of the alluvial plain near the coast. His house was understood to sit directly above the Abzu, the subterranean sweetwater ocean on which the earth itself floated, and from this position he presided over knowledge, craft, and the ordering of the world. He was, by most measures, the most knowledgeable of the gods. He had custody of the meat, and Inanna from Uruk, from the house of heaven, decides to go to Eridu and see what she can acquire. The journey itself is not described in great detail in the surviving texts. What the myth dwells on instead is the arrival, the meeting, and what happens next. Enki, upon hearing that Inanna has come to Eridu, orders a feast prepared. There is food and drink, there is beer, and in the version of the events the texts preserve, Enki, loosened perhaps by the hospitality of his own banquet, begins offering Inanna gifts from the treasury of the me. One after another, he names them and gives them. He gives her the high priesthood. He gives her the office of godship. He gives her the descent into the underworld and the ascent from it. He gives her the art of the smith, the craft of the scribe, the art of lamentation, the art of music. By the time the offering stops, Inanna has been given, or has taken, depending on how the text is being read, a vast portion of the divine order of civilization, and she loads them onto her boat and begins the journey back up the river to Uruk. Some readings of this myth frame it as a story about divine intoxication and its consequences. Enki sobers up, regrets the transaction, sends servants and monsters to retrieve what he gave, and Inanna and her boat make it to Uruk anyway, the me secured. Other readings hold that Inanna did not simply receive the Mi as gifts from a momentarily unguarded host, but went to Eridu with the precise intention of acquiring them by whatever means the situation offered. Both readings are supported by different moments in the cuneiform text. What neither reading disputes is the outcome. Inanna arrives in Uruk with the Mi. The city receives them with celebration and the full apparatus of civilization: priests, smiths, scribes, lament singers, the instruments of music, the laws of kingship, comes to rest in her city under her governance. The boat that carries her back across the river, low in the water with the divine objects it holds, arrives at Uruk while the morning sky is still pale over the temple walls. This is the kind of goddess the love poetry is addressed to, not a minor aspect of a larger system, not a figure of limited authority who happens to also be associated with desire, but a deity whose domain includes the structural foundations of existence itself, who has demonstrated the capacity to move between worlds, to acquire what she needs by whatever combination of beauty, intelligence, and determination the situation requires, and to bring it home. The scribes who copied love poems in the schools of Nippur knew this. The lament priests who recited her hymns in the temple precincts knew this. When they wrote about her longing for Dumuzi, they were writing about someone whose feelings had weight in proportion to her power. Inanna's connection to the city of Uruk is not only theological, it is woven into the Eridu precinct's physical history in a way that can still be traced. The temple complex that stood at the center of Uruk during the 3rd millennium BCE was a large and carefully maintained structure. Its raised platform meant that the white plastered walls of its upper buildings were visible from a considerable distance across the flat Mesopotamian plain, catching the early light and holding it while the surrounding fields were still in shadow. The platform had been built up over many generations, each new construction adding to the height of what had come before, in the Mesopotamian manner of sacred buildings that accumulated the weight of history in their very mud brick mass. Inside, there were storerooms, there were courts, there were spaces for the ritual activities that kept Inanna's worship functioning, the festivals, the hymns, the annual celebrations of her divine relationships. The city and the goddess were not separate entities in which one served the other. They were understood to be constitutive of one another. Uruk was Inanna's city in the way that a living thing is constituted by whatever animates it. What the cuneiform sources allow us to see, if we look carefully enough at the breadth of Inanna's attributes rather than focusing only on one of them, is a figure whose character is more genuinely paradoxical than that of almost any other deity in the ancient world. She is associated with love in its most tender and specific forms. The love songs have her describing desire with a directness that 4,000 years of distance does not soften. She is also associated with war in its most direct form. The battle hymns have her striding into combat with weapons and with an eagerness that the texts do not distance with qualification. She is connected to the abundance of the harvest and the overflowing of the storerooms. She is connected to the destruction of what she decides should not continue. She is the goddess who in one tradition descends into the underworld and must be helped back out by beings made of clay. She is the goddess who in another tradition loads the fundamental laws of civilization onto a boat and brings them home to her city. These are not contradictions that the Sumerian religious tradition felt needed resolving. They were the complete shape of a force too large to be held in a single category. Temple iconography from across the Mesopotamian tradition depicts Inanna in ways that reflect this breadth. In some images, she is shown with weapons rising from her shoulders, the visual language of divine power made physical. In others, she is shown in association with the lion, the animal most regularly paired with her in Mesopotamian imagery, alert, capable of both stillness and sudden movement, associated with heat and strength rather than with anything docile. In still others, she is shown with the eight-pointed star, the symbol specifically associated with Venus, which became one of the most persistent visual signs of her presence across centuries of Mesopotamian art. Each of these is a different angle on the same figure, and each is supported by specific hymns and myths that flesh out what the image points toward. The eight-pointed star is worth pausing on because the astronomical reality behind it is one of the more precise intersections of observation and theology in the ancient world. The planet Venus, over the course of approximately 584 days, its synodic cycle, the period between successive appearances in the same position relative to the Sun, traces a path that, when plotted across 5 complete cycles, produces a near-perfect 5-pointed pattern. The Mesopotamian astronomers who tracked this planet with sufficient precision to predict its behavior were tracking something that was simultaneously a theological fact about Inanna and a mathematical reality about the movements of a planet. The observation of Venus as morning star, appearing on the eastern horizon before sunrise, bright enough to be unmistakable, was followed by a period of invisibility as the planet moved between the Earth and the Sun, and then by its reappearance as evening star, visible in the western sky after sunset. The gap between the two appearances, the period of invisibility, was the period during which Inanna was understood to be below, in the country of the dead, or at the edges of the world, or moving through whatever passage the tradition held she was moving through. Her return to visibility was her return to the world above. The Mesopotamian astronomical texts that document Venus observations are careful and precise. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, which records the planet's appearances and disappearances over a period of approximately 21 years during the Old Babylonian period, is among the earliest surviving astronomical records of its kind. It lists in cuneiform the dates of Venus's first and last visibility, in both its morning and evening aspects, column by column, in the manner of a record kept for practical religious use, so that priests would know when to expect Inanna's appearance and absence, when to prepare certain rites, and when to hold certain observances. The planet's behavior was not a metaphor supporting an already established myth. The myth and the astronomical observation were understood to be descriptions of the same truth, arriving from different angles. This dual nature, the star of the morning and the star of the evening, the same bright point visible in two different skies at different hours of the day, gave Inanna a quality that very few other deities in any tradition quite share. She was understood to be simultaneously the earliest light before dawn and the last light after sunset. The same object observed at opposite ends of the sky in opposite directions, in the darkness before morning and the darkness after evening. A temple astronomer tracking her in the registers would mark both appearances as appearances of the same deity, the same presence moving through the same long arc above the same city, even though the planet of the morning and the planet of the evening look, from the ground, as though they cannot be the same thing. The theology that organized all of this, the love poetry, the wars, the me, the seasonal associations, the astronomical precision, the temple at Uruk, the lament songs of Enheduanna, was not a theology of simplification. It did not attempt to reduce Inanna to a single manageable domain, to make her easier to hold in the mind, by removing the aspects of her that complicated the simpler ones. The Sumerian religious tradition, at its most developed, was comfortable holding complexity without resolving it. Inanna was all of these things simultaneously, and the scribes and priests who served her spent considerable effort making sure that all of her attributes were documented, hymned, and liturgically maintained. The care that went into cataloging the me, that long list of divine objects pressed into clay, each one a specific piece of the world, is the same care that went into the hymns that listed Inanna's powers one by one in formal praise. The listing was not administrative, it was devotional. To name a thing completely was to honor it completely. Inanna understood this. Her hymns to Inanna do not focus on one aspect of the goddess at the expense of others. They hold the warrior and the lover, the destroyer and the builder, the figure who descends and the figure who returns, in the same extended breath. Reading them, even in translation, even at 4,000 years distance, there is a quality of genuine comprehension at work, not merely a poet praising what she is supposed to praise, but a woman thinking hard about what she understands to be true and finding language adequate to carry it. Her name survived because the scribes kept copying what she wrote, and the scribes kept copying it because what she wrote was recognized, generation after generation, as worth copying. The tradition continued to agree with her. The Inanna temple, rising on its platform at the center of Uruk, would have been visible to anyone approaching the city from the flat plain around it, long before they could make out the city walls. The whitened plaster of its upper walls caught the morning light, and in the very early hours, in the hour when Venus was still visible on the eastern horizon, the temple and the star might have been seen in the same glance, the human-made structure rising from the earth, and the divine presence marking the sky above it, both of them belonging to the same figure, the same goddess, the same force that held kingship in one hand and desire in the other, and descended periodically into the dark and came back. What the surviving texts describe, when taken together across their many genres and periods, is not a deity whose character was assembled piece by piece and whose contradictions were never quite resolved. What they describe is a deity whose complexity was the point, whose worshippers understood that the force presiding over love and the force presiding over war were not opposed but continuous, expressions of the same energy working at different scales and in different registers. The love songs in which she calls Dumuzi her honeyman, the battle hymns in which she is given weapons and eagerness in equal measure, the astronomical records in which her movement through the sky is tracked with numerical precision, all of these are describing the same figure, and the people who produced them knew that. The me that Inanna acquired on her journey to Eridu and brought back to Uruk on her low-riding boat did not simply sit in the temple storerooms. They were understood to be active in the world, present in every priest who performed a rite, every scribe who pressed cuneiform into clay, every smith who worked bronze, every lament singer who raised a voice in the formal rhythm of grief. Because the me were in Uruk and Uruk was Inanna's city, the structures of civilization that the me represented were understood to be under her governance. When a king of Uruk composed a royal hymn claiming a sacred connection to Inanna, claiming, in the language of the Dumuzi love songs, to stand in the shepherd's place, he was participating in a theological system whose internal logic was fully worked out, traceable back through the me to the question of what civilization was and who was responsible for maintaining it. The goddess whose worship and Hedbwana documented in her hymns was already ancient in 2285 BCE. The Inanna precinct at Uruk reaches back another 1,000 years before that. The astronomical observations that identified Inanna with Venus were being made during the same centuries that the temple was being built up, layer by layer, on its raised platform. When the planet appeared on the eastern horizon in the hour before dawn, there was already a very long tradition of standing on a temple roof and watching for it, of making marks in clay to record what was seen, of understanding the appearance as something that mattered beyond the astronomical. The record of that watching, the clay registers, the cuneiform astronomical texts, the hymns, the love songs, the lists of me, the lament rites of Enheduanna, accumulated over centuries into a portrait of a figure whose attributes covered, between them, nearly everything a civilization could need a deity to govern. There is something quietly remarkable in the way this portrait accumulated, not through a single authoritative telling, but through scribes in different cities copying the same texts onto different tablets, through temple singers developing their own versions of the same refrains, through astronomers in different periods adding new columns to the Venus observation records, through priests in the temples of Uruk and Ur and Nippur maintaining the same figure across changes of dynasty and conquest, and the slow shifting of cultural emphasis that thousands of years inevitably bring. Inanna survived all of it. Her name, her attributes, her city, her connection to the brightest light in the pre-dawn sky, moving forward through the written record in the hands of scribes who were copying because the tradition required copying, and because what they were copying was worth the effort, and the planet itself kept moving, as it had always moved, without reference to the records being kept about it. It appeared in the east before dawn, and after its period of invisibility, it appeared in the west after sunset, the same bright point in two different positions in the sky. The same goddess, the tradition held, present at the beginning of the day and the end of it, the first light anyone standing on the plain might see, and the last light visible before the sky went fully dark. Both appearances belonging to the same arc, the same long ellipse that the planet traces in the sky above southern Mesopotamia, above the flat land and the river and the white walls of the temple on its raised platform, year after year, in the particular way that things which have been watched for long enough eventually feel inevitable. The star appears, it moves, it disappears, and then, after the required number of days, documented now in tablets, in columns of careful cuneiform, in the records of those who had been watching long enough to know, it appears again in the opposite sky, as bright as it was before, as unmistakable, and no less itself for having been invisible in the interval. The pastures are still green. That is the first thing to hold on to. The color of the land before the heat arrives, the particular softness of a Mesopotamian spring morning, when the grasses along the riverbank have not yet begun to dry. Goats move through low scrub near the water's edge, their bells a loose, uneven sound across the flat land. The air carries the smell of mud and new grass, and somewhere the faint sweetness of blossoming tamarisk, and the sky above the plain is wide and pale and still cool at its edges. And this, the green land, the moving animals, the unhurried morning, is the landscape that belonged to Dumuzi the shepherd before the summer came to take it. He is one of the most widely traveled figures in all of ancient Mesopotamian tradition. His name moved from the scribal cities of ancient Sumer through the long centuries of Babylonian culture, crossed into Akkadian and then into Aramaic, and arrived finally in a Hebrew prophetic text written in Jerusalem in the 6th century before the Common Era, where it appears as Tammuz, a Sumerian shepherd god's name, written in a language he was never born into, mourned by people who had never set foot on the pastures where his story began. That journey took more than a millennium and a half. It crossed empires and languages and religious boundaries that most traditions do not survive. And yet the name held, and the mourning held with it, and the grief for this particular figure, the shepherd who came into his flourishing in spring and left it behind when summer arrived, turned out to be something that people far from Sumer understood well enough to perform as an annual ritual in the heat of the 4th month every year for centuries. The Sumerian king list preserves one of the oldest written references to Dumuzi. The king list is a cuneiform document cataloging the rulers of ancient Mesopotamia in a long, unbroken succession, kings before the legendary flood and kings after it, each assigned a city and a reign, their lengths varying from the plausible to the extraordinary. Among the pre-flood kings, the list includes a figure named Dumuzi the Shepherd, assigned to the city of Bad Tabira, and given a reign of 36,000 years. Later in the same document, among the post-flood kings of Uruk, another Dumuzi appears, a separate individual, the Dumuzi the Fisherman, placed in a different city and a different era entirely. The king list sets them side by side in its long column of names without explaining the doubling, because the scribes who composed it understood both figures as part of the same tradition, the mythological and the historical occupying the same register of the record, pressed into clay in the same careful wedge marks, as though 36,000 years and a historical Uruk kingship were simply different chapters in a continuous story. That doubling is worth sitting with. Sumerian tradition does not flatten Dumuzi into a single consistent figure. There is Dumuzi the shepherd, the lover of Inanna, the figure at the center of the substitution myth, the deity whose fate would eventually organize an entire month of mourning ritual across the Mesopotamian world. And there is Dumuzi the fisherman, an ancient ruler of Uruk, who appears in the king list as a distinct individual associated with a different city and a different role. Whether these two Dumuzis were always understood as the same being in different aspects, or whether they began as genuinely separate local traditions that the scribal culture eventually brought into proximity, the records do not say clearly. What the records do say is that the tradition was comfortable holding both, that the name Dumuzi could mean a pre-flood shepherd king of mythological dimensions, a post-flood mortal king of a historical city, and the divine consort of Inanna, and that these identities were not felt to contradict one another in a way that required resolution. His name, in its Sumerian form, is generally rendered as meaning something like true son or faithful son. The translation carries a quality of genuine relation, not simply offspring, but son in the sense of one who is authentically of his lineage, one who fulfills what his origins promised. In his divine role, what Dumuzi is the faithful son of is not any particular deity, but the season itself. He personifies the life force that rises in the land when the cold breaks and the grasses begin, the specific vitality of spring and early summer, the time when the flocks are in their pastures and the rivers are still full, and the earth is doing what it does when everything goes well. He is the flourishing before the diminishment, the green before the dry. In the Mesopotamian summer, the death heat that descends on the plain sometime around June and July, when the grasses burn and the river falls and the land enters its long, still, parched interval. That too belongs to his story, because the myth understands his descent into the underworld and the land's summer dormancy as the same event told from two different angles. The Babylonian calendar formalized what the seasons already made visible. The 4th month of the Babylonian year corresponding roughly to June and July in the modern calendar, was named Dumuzi, later Tammuz, in its Semitic form. The naming was not incidental. That month, as the heat arrived and the land dried and the rivers fell, the Babylonian religious calendar called for mourning rites conducted in Dumuzi's name. Documented in temple calendars and administrative records across several centuries, these rites involved lament songs composed specifically for the occasion, the carrying or displaying of the god's image in public procession, and the kind of communal grief that required not private reflection but collective bodily expression. Voices raised, heads bowed, the sound of hand drums marking the rhythm of lamentation through streets that were already hot with the arriving summer. The priests had texts prepared. The singers knew the refrains. The ritual was repeated year after year, as regular as the heat itself, because the heat and the god's departure were, in the tradition's understanding, the same thing. What is interesting about those rites is not simply that they happened, but how completely they embedded Dumuzi in the experience of living through a Mesopotamian summer. The heat was not arbitrary. The drying of the pastures was not random misfortune. The land's long, still, difficult interval had a name, and the name was Dumuzi, and the appropriate response to that interval was not simply endurance but grief, organized, ritualized, shared grief, performed in public at a set time with established texts and forms. The summer was mournable. The god's absence was the shape the summer took, and when the season turned and the land began to revive, the return was not separate from the god either. He was the green of the returning pastures. He was the full river. He was the morning when the air was cool again, and the goats moved back into the pastures that had been empty. His departure and his return were not metaphors for the seasons. In the tradition's understanding, they were the seasons felt from the inside. A Babylonian temple calendar in the month of Tammuz would have been a practical document, inscribed on clay, kept in the temple archive, annotated with the specific obligations of the priests for each day of the month, what songs to sing, what images to display, what offerings to prepare. It was administrative as much as theological, the kind of record that kept a large religious institution functioning through a year's worth of ritual demands. Somewhere in that document, the name Tammuz appears at the top of the month, and the mood it signals is mourning, and the priests reading it knew exactly what was required. The lament texts they performed were old, some of them very old, inherited from the Sumerian tradition that preceded the Babylonian, and preserved in the temple libraries, alongside the administrative calendars. A priest in Babylon in the 8th century before the Common Era, preparing to lead the Tammuz rites, might have been working from texts that were already 1,000 years old, copied and recopied by generations of scribes who understood them as worth preserving because the heat came back every year and the god needed to be mourned in the right words. The image of women carrying a small figure of Tammuz through a Babylonian street in the 4th month has the quality of something that actually happened, not once, not as a special occasion, but year after year as a known feature of midsummer in a city that took its religious calendar seriously. The sound of hand drums and voices raised in lament, the particular quality of that summer light in Mesopotamia, hard and flat and very bright. The image of the god held carefully through the heat, processed through a city going about its work, the mourning happening publicly alongside everything else, the markets, the craft workshops, the ordinary movement of people through streets that were, for this 1 month, also streets of grief. The ritual did not require that everyone pause their lives to participate. It required that the grief happen, that it be voiced, that it be seen, and that the community recognized together that this was the month when the god was gone and the land showed it. The cult's reach beyond Mesopotamia is documented precisely enough to be remarkable. In the 8th chapter of the book of Ezekiel, dated by scholars to approximately 592 before the Common Era, the prophet describes a vision of the Jerusalem temple in which he is shown a series of ritual violations, practices that, in the tradition the text represents, constitute forms of apostasy, worship directed toward figures other than the God of Israel. Among the violations he describes is this: at the north gate of the temple, he sees women seated at the threshold, their heads bowed. They are weeping. The text names what they are weeping for: Tammuz. The prophet presents this as something worth recording in his vision of what was happening in the temple, not because it was obscure or unfamiliar, but precisely because it was recognizable, because his audience would understand immediately what the weeping for Tammuz meant and why it was being presented as a problem. That passage in Ezekiel is one of the most concrete pieces of evidence for how far the Dumuzi cult traveled. By 592, before the Common Era, the mourning rites for a Sumerian shepherd god had penetrated the religious culture of Judah to the point where they were being performed inside the Jerusalem temple complex. The women sitting at the north gate threshold and weeping for Tammuz were not recent arrivals from Babylon or Assyria, or if some of them were, the practice was established enough, widespread enough, to have become something the prophet could name and criticize as a known feature of the religious landscape. The Babylonian dominance of the region in that period created the conditions for this kind of cultural transmission. Babylonian religious practices traveled with Babylonian power, and the annual mourning for Tammuz was prominent enough in Babylonian culture to make the journey. What is quietly striking about that passage is how ordinary the women's grief appears to be. Ezekiel does not describe them as performing something exotic or alarming in its form. They are simply sitting and weeping, and the object of their mourning is Tammuz. The ritual form is familiar enough to require no description beyond the name, and the name is Sumerian. The god being mourned at the north gate of the Jerusalem temple in 592 before the Common Era had begun, in the tradition's oldest layers, as a shepherd on the Mesopotamian plain, living in the green time before the summer arrived, moving his flocks along the riverbank in the cool of a spring morning. Between that pastoral origin and that Jerusalem threshold lay more than 1,500 years of transmission, translation, adaptation, and arrival in a new religious world that had reasons to resist the mourning even as it practiced it. The Sumerian material about Dumuzi is layered in the way that traditions assembled over centuries tend to be. The figure who appears in the love poetry attributed to the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi is warm and specific and pastoral, a shepherd whose world smells of fresh milk and open pasture, whose hands and lips carry the sweetness of honey in the poems that describe him. That figure and the figure of the dying god, mourned in the heat of midsummer, are the same being, held together in the tradition's understanding, without forcing a single narrative to reconcile them. He is the beloved of the goddess, and the god of the dying season, and the ancient king of a pre-flood city, and the name written on a Babylonian calendar as the signal for communal grief. And all of these are Dumuzi, all of them pressed into clay at various points across the long span of Mesopotamian literary and religious culture. The scribal schools of Nippur, where so much of this material was preserved, treated Dumuzi's texts as a normal part of the curriculum. Student scribes copied lament songs for Tammuz alongside creation hymns and royal panegyrics in practical administrative forms, pressing the wedge marks of the god's name into soft clay as an exercise in scribal craft. The love songs and the mourning songs and the mythological narratives about Dumuzi's fate were all considered worth transmitting, all considered part of what a trained scribe should know. That institutional commitment to copying and preserving the texts is why they survived at all. Tens of thousands of tablets came out of Nippur across the course of excavations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and within that enormous archive, the Dumuzi material appears in enough copies from enough different time periods to make clear that these texts were considered important and worth maintaining across the full lifespan of Sumerian scribal culture. The name Dumuzi in the Babylonian calendar is one of those details that carries a long history in a very small space. A scribe marking the fourth month on a clay tablet, pressing the wedge marks that spell out the name of the month, was doing an administrative task, keeping track of time, organizing the religious year, and also, without any particular ceremony, carrying forward a name that had been associated with the green time and its ending for more than 1,000 years. The name on the calendar was also a god, and the god was also a season, and the season arrived every year with the same quality: the heat settling in, the pastures drying, the land going still, and every year the lament texts were brought out, and the mourning was performed, and the month was lived through, and when it ended, the god had not yet returned, but the ritual had been completed, and the completion was its own form of continuity. Inanna, Dumuzi's sister, appears in the texts associated with his fate as a figure of considerable depth. Her name connects her to the vine, to the cultivated plant that produces the fruit of late summer and autumn, to something that flourishes in the time when Dumuzi does not. She is also associated in the texts with dream interpretation, with the reading of the images that arrive in sleep and require a knowledge of symbolic language to understand. In the narrative traditions that concern Dumuzi's final crisis, Inanna appears at the moment when her brother's dreams have already told him something he needs to understand, and she is the one who can read what those images mean and speak it plainly. The tradition assigns her a specific competence, not magic in a general sense, but the particular skill of attending to the images of sleep and knowing their significance. What she and Dumuzi share, beyond blood, is a particular kind of link to the seasonal world. He rises in spring and descends in summer. She is associated with the vine, which does its work in the season after him, producing its fruit in the autumn when his half of the year is already gone. They are not identical in their associations, but they belong to the same agricultural and pastoral world, and the tradition imagines their fates as entwined in a way that goes beyond simple sibling affection. The arrangement that would eventually resolve the crisis of the myth, the division of the year between them, each spending half above the ground and half below, gives the seasonal calendar a shape grounded in this specific relationship. This particular pair of figures, who are bound to one another, not just by family, but by the structure of the world they embody. In the broader tradition of Mesopotamian mythology, Dumuzi holds a position that is not quite like any single figure in other ancient traditions. He is a god who dies, or, more precisely, who descends, and whose descent is not a catastrophe in the long view of the tradition, but a feature of how the world works. The year has its green time and its dry time, and the green time belongs to Dumuzi, and when it ends, he goes below, and when it returns, he comes back, and the tradition expresses this not as tragedy, but as the shape of things, the rhythm that the world maintains, because of an arrangement entered into by specific named figures under specific circumstances. The circumstances are mythological. The rhythm is the actual climate of the Mesopotamian plain, felt in the body and in the land year after year by everyone who lived there. That insistence on the seasonal rhythm as a living mythological arrangement, rather than simply a natural fact explained in divine terms, is one of the things that makes the Dumuzi tradition feel genuinely specific to its place and climate. The Mesopotamian summer is not a mild inconvenience. It is a serious, extended, demanding interval, months of heat that can kill, months when the pastures are empty and the rivers are low and the land is waiting. The tradition does not soften that interval or make it easy to bear. It assigns it a name and a shape and a theology, and it says this is what the world costs. There is a God who embodies what flourishes, and when the flourishing ends, the God goes below, and the mourning that the culture performs in that month is not merely symbolic. It is the appropriate response to what is actually happening outside, in the heat, in the dried pastures, in the quiet of a landscape that is waiting for its other half to return. The women at the north gate of the Jerusalem temple, in Ezekiel's vision, were doing something that had been done in various forms for centuries before them. The hand drums and the lament songs that accompanied the Babylonian rites of the fourth month had predecessors in the Sumerian lament traditions that preceded the Babylonian by 1,000 years or more. The mourning for Dumuzi, its specific emotional texture, its communal quality, its formal structure of repeated lament and seasonal grief, was old before Babylon inherited it, and older still before Jerusalem ever encountered it. That the tradition arrived in Jerusalem in the 6th century, before the Common Era, and found women willing to sit at a temple threshold and weep for a Sumerian shepherd. God says something about how deeply the emotional logic of the rites traveled, how fully the image of the god who departed in the summer and needed to be mourned took root in cultures that had no direct connection to the pastoral landscape where the story began. A spring morning on the Mesopotamian plain is its own kind of argument for why such a figure needed to exist. The green is real. The coolness of the air before the heat arrives is real. The sound of animals moving through low scrub near the water, and the smell of new grass, and the particular quality of the light when everything is still alive and growing, all of that is real and temporary and worth mourning when it goes. Dumuzi is the name the tradition gave to that reality. Not a metaphor for spring, not a symbol of agricultural renewal. The specific named god of this exact quality of mourning, this particular green, this temporary abundance, and the god of its departure when the heat came, and the god of the mourning rites that mark the departure, and eventually the god whose name appeared on a Babylonian calendar month in wedge marks of cuneiform pressed into clay, the same shape of name pressed year after year in the same fourth month, because the heat came back every year, and the mourning needed to come back with it. The kingless scribe who pressed Dumuzi the shepherd's name into a column alongside kings with reigns of tens of thousands of years was not confused about the difference between mythology and history. The document was already operating in a register where the mythological and the historical were understood as parts of a single continuous record of the past. A king who reigned for 36,000 years before the flood, and a shepherd god who personified the spring, and a specific month on the Babylonian calendar, and a name appearing in a Hebrew prophetic text in Jerusalem, all of these are the same figure, understood differently by different cultures at different moments, but recognizably continuous in the quality of mourning they required, and the season they named, and the god they were, in the end still calling Dumuzi. That name, Tammuz, appearing in Ezekiel's text, is the furthest point the tradition reaches in the written record available to us. A Sumerian shepherd's name, carried through Babylonian culture across more than a millennium, arriving in Jerusalem in the 6th century before the Common Era, written into a Hebrew prophetic book as the object of women's tears at a temple gate. The women are sitting. The morning is hot, presumably, or nearly hot. It is the 4th month, the month of his departure. Their heads are bowed, and they are weeping for Tammuz, which is to say, they are weeping for the god of the green time, for the shepherd on the spring plain, for the cool morning that came before the heat, for everything that the name had always meant in the tradition that began it, and every tradition that received it after, how far a name can travel, how completely the grief it carries can survive the journey. A reed stylus resting on the edge of a damp clay tablet, that is where this part of the story begins. Not with a god descending or a throne claimed, but with something smaller and more patient, a scribe in a room in Nippur, in the city that scribes considered their own, pressing words into soft earth with a cut reed, one careful wedge mark at a time. The tablet is fresh enough that the clay gives slightly under pressure, yielding to each impression without resistance, and what is being pressed into it is a love poem, not a hymn of cosmic power, not a list of divine attributes, a poem about lips that taste of honey, and hands that feel like honey, and a woman who is waiting for a man she loves with a specific, unhurried, physical longing that has not changed in its emotional content between the moment it was first sung and the moment it was first pressed into clay, and any moment after that in which a person has read it. The love poetry of Inanna and Dumuzi is among the oldest surviving literature of its kind in any language. That is not a claim made to impress. It is simply what the tablets indicate, what the scholars who have read and dated and translated them have concluded after the careful, slow work of comparison and reconstruction. The poems exist. They are old enough that the traditions behind them were already old when the scribes of Nippur first recorded them, and they are, by any honest description, love poetry, not allegory, dressed as love poetry, not symbolic theology, using erotic imagery as a convenient vehicle, but words in which desire is described with the frank, warm precision of someone who knows exactly what they mean and means it. Inanna calls Dumuzi her honey man. That phrase, specific, sensory, slightly unexpected, appears in the texts with the quality of a refrain, something sung rather than merely stated, returned to because returning to it gives pleasure. His lips are honey, his hands are honey. The poem does not ask the listener to imagine an abstract sweetness. It names the sweetness, locates it in the body, repeats it until the word itself starts to feel like the thing it describes. In the oldest surviving love literature of the world, the first writer reaching for a word to describe what the beloved's touch feels like, chose honey and chose it carefully enough, with enough confidence in the rightness of the choice, that the word has sat in its pressed wedge form in the clay for 4,000 years without losing a single syllable of what it meant. The scribe recording this poem in the scribal school at Nippur was not, in all likelihood, a love-struck young man. The boys who trained in the tablet houses, the eduba, as the schools were called, copied texts as exercises, as a way of learning the wedge marks and the grammatical structures and the formulaic patterns that made cuneiform writing work. A love song was as appropriate a practice text as a king list or a hymn to the moon. The student pressed the reed carefully, trying to keep the marks clean and even, probably concentrating harder on the quality of the impression than on the content of what was being recorded, what the text meant to the student who copied it, whether it moved them or amused them, or simply tired their hands, is something the tablets do not record. What they do record is the poem, The specific words, the refrains, the images carried forward through the routine work of a school day, and preserved without anyone planning to preserve it, because clay is durable and dry southern Iraqi soil is very good at holding what falls into it. The love poetry of Inanna and Dumuzi was not incidental to the religious life of ancient Sumer. It was woven into it in ways that are still being traced and understood. The story of Inanna and Dumuzi moves through several distinct phases, and the courtship poems represent the earliest and warmest of them, the period in which the goddess and the shepherd are first drawn to one another, in which the possibility of their union is established, or in which the world the poetry describes is a world of abundance and tenderness, and the particular sweetness of anticipation. Before any of the story's harder turns, there is this: a goddess who finds a man she wants and chooses him, and says so with the directness of someone who is not in the habit of being refused. The question of who had a say in that choice belongs to the cultural world the poems came from. Inanna is a goddess. She is, among other things, the goddess of love itself, and yet even she, in the tradition as the text recorded, required the endorsement of her brother before her union with Dumuzi could be fully ratified. Utu was her brother. In the Sumerian tradition, Utu was the sun god, the god of justice, the figure who rose each morning from between the mountains, and who carried with him the divine authority of law and right conduct. His rays are depicted in Sumerian imagery emerging from his shoulders as he rises, and his face is associated with the clarity of day, the unambiguous light in which things can be seen as they are. Inanna loved Dumuzi, but Utu had to agree. His agreement, in the tradition, is not reluctant. Utu does not withhold his endorsement, and then give it grudgingly. The texts present him as someone who understands the worth of Dumuzi, who can vouch for the shepherd's value, and does so, a brother giving his formal, genuine approval to a match he believes in. That his approval was required at all reflects something specific and true about the world the poems inhabited, a world in which a woman's marriage, even a goddess's marriage, was understood to require the sanction of her male kin, and in which that sanction of her, when given freely and with genuine regard, was understood to be an act of care rather than control. The tradition does not present this as a constraint on Inanna. It presents it as a structure she moves within, the way the sun moves within the sky. The structure is the condition of the motion, not its obstacle. Before Inanna made her choice, there was a debate. That is perhaps not the most obviously romantic beginning to a courtship story, but in the Sumerian tradition, it is a structurally satisfying one, because the tradition loved debate. The genre was called the disputation poem, or the debate poem, and it was exactly what it sounds like: two opposing figures or principles arguing for their superiority before a divine judge, each presenting the case for their own value in the most persuasive terms available to them. Farmers and shepherds argued. Summer and winter argued. The hoe and the plow argued. These were not trivial literary exercises. The debates took seriously the question of what things were worth, what made one kind of life, or one kind of labor, or one kind of being more valuable than another, and they trusted the genre to carry the weight of that question without collapsing under it. The debate for Inanna's hand placed Dumuzi the shepherd against Enkidu the farmer. The figures represent more than their occupations. Dumuzi, the shepherd, embodies the open pasture, the world of animals and movement, the landscape that exists beyond the cultivated field, the wide steppe with its seasonal rhythms, and its milk, and its wool, and its particular abundance. Enkidu, the farmer, represents the field itself, the ordered work of irrigation and planting and harvest, the world that depends on the channeled water and the managed soil. Both figures are real in the world the poems describe. Both forms of life were genuinely present and genuinely valued in ancient Sumer, where the irrigated fields of the river valleys fed the cities and the pastoral lands beyond them provided everything the fields could not. The debate is not between the worthless and the worthy. It is between two things worth having, and the question is which one Inanna wants. In the version of the debate that survives, Enkidu speaks of his fields, of the grain he grows, of the abundance his careful work produces. Dumuzi speaks of what the shepherd's life yields, milk and cream and wool, the richness of the pastoral world that the farmed world cannot duplicate. Inanna listens, and in the end, Inanna chooses Dumuzi. The tradition does not dwell on Enkidu's loss at great length. He accepts the outcome. The story moves forward into the courtship itself, into the world of honey and tenderness, and Enkidu the farmer becomes a name in a debate that Inanna settled long ago in favor of the man with honey on his lips. What followed the choice was described in the love poems with a physical specificity that makes the tablets remarkable even now. Inanna speaks in her own voice about preparing herself for Dumuzi, bathing, adorning herself, the anticipation of his arrival carrying through every image. She describes herself as the earth prepared for cultivation, open, ready, expecting what comes with the right season. That image, the goddess as the earth awaiting rain and seed, moves between the erotic and the agricultural so easily and naturally that the movement does not feel like metaphor. In the world these poems came from, the fertility of the earth and the desire of the goddess were not merely analogous, they were understood as versions of the same thing, one visible and one divine, each reflecting and ratifying the other. The descriptions of Dumuzi are built in the same mode. He is not an abstraction of male beauty. He is physically present in the poems. His hair, his hands, the sound of his voice, the specific warmth of his nearness. The love poetry of this tradition is not coy. It does not speak at the thing it means from a careful distance. It says what it means with the directness of someone speaking into the ear of the beloved, certain enough to be specific. The honey image returns and returns, not because the poets lacked other words, but because the right word, named often enough, becomes the thing itself. The love poetry also contains descriptions of Inanna's own domestic space, the storerooms of her temple, the grain piled inside, the cedar oil, the abundance she presides over, and in the poems the space becomes the setting in which she waits for Dumuzi, the physical environment of their love, given the same careful inventory as the love itself. The abundance of the storeroom and the abundance of desire are treated as belonging to the same order of things. Both are gifts. Both are understood to be connected. The grain in the storeroom and the desire in the heart and the love between the goddess and the shepherd, all part of a single flowing fact about the world, which is that it can be full. Around this love poetry, at a scale the poems themselves do not describe, but the ritual world of ancient Sumer, recorded elsewhere, was a ceremony that scholars call the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage. The phrase is Greek, but the practice it names belongs to the much older Sumerian world. What the sacred marriage involved in concrete terms has been the subject of considerable scholarly discussion over many decades, and a settled answer to the question of exactly what happened in the ceremony, and how literally its various elements were enacted, is not something the sources fully provide. What is not in dispute is that the ceremony existed, that it was associated with Inanna, and that it was understood to be connected to the fertility of the land, the legitimacy of the king, and the continuation of divine blessing into the world. The ceremony involved the Sumerian king performing the role of Dumuzi. That much the texts make clear. The king in the ritual was not simply representing Dumuzi from the outside, the way an actor represents a character while remaining distinct from them. The language of the text suggests something closer to identification, the king becoming, for the purposes of the ritual, the figure of the shepherd god who loved Inanna, and enacting through that identification a renewal of the covenant between the divine and the human world. What exactly this enactment involved, where it took place, who participated, and how the presence of Inanna was understood to be present within it. These are questions the scholarly record engages with, carefully and without complete resolution. What does survive in full detail is the royal poetry from the earthly period, roughly the century between 2094 and 2029 BCE, in which kings identify themselves explicitly with Dumuzi in the context of their relationship with Inanna. Shogi, one of the great kings of that dynasty, is documented in royal hymns speaking in the language of the Dumuzi love poetry, using the same images of honey and tenderness and divine favor, applying to himself the words that in the older text belong to the shepherd. The king is the honey man. The king is the one Inanna has chosen. The king stands in the place Dumuzi occupied in the courtship poems, and in standing there, he claims the blessing that the shepherd's love was understood to have secured. Shusin, a later king of the same dynasty, is similarly documented. A hymn attributed to his reign uses erotic imagery drawn directly from the Inanna Dumuzi courtship poems, the goddess speaking of her king with the same desire and warmth she directed at her shepherd. That a living king of Sumer in the 21st century BCE commissioned poetry, placing him in Dumuzi's role within a love poem addressed to Inanna by name, is a concrete, documented fact about how this tradition was used, how the love story of a goddess and a shepherd was taken up into the political theology of a state, how poetry about honey and longing was pressed into service as the language in which power justified itself before the divine. The political function of the sacred marriage did not reduce the love poetry to mere propaganda. The two things existed alongside each other, the intimate and the ceremonial, the tender and the institutional, and the tradition seemed comfortable holding both without resolving the tension between them into a single meaning. A poem could be a love song and a ritual text and a political claim and a scribal practice exercise, all at once, each use layering onto the others without canceling them. The way a piece of cloth can be warm and beautiful and expensive and a gift and a sign of status, all in the same moment without becoming only one of those things. The courtship narrative, the debate, the choice, the endorsement, the preparation, the union, moves in the tradition as a kind of season in itself. It has the quality of the pastures in spring, full, unhurried, warm, and carrying within its fullness the sense that what is full has taken time to become so. The love poetry was not composed quickly. The refrains, phrases like honey man, returned to again and again across multiple texts, have the quality of lines that were sung many times before they were written, phrases worn smooth by repetition into a form so familiar it became ceremonially necessary. When the temple singers performed these texts in Uruk, or in Nippur, or in whatever city held a version of this poetry within its ritual life, they were not reading from a page. They were singing words they already knew, in rhythms their bodies had memorized, to an audience who knew the refrains and could feel the moment of return when the familiar phrase came around again. The call and response structure that scholars have identified within the love poems points toward this oral life before the clay tablets. In call and response singing, the full meaning of the form is not available to a reader alone with the text. The form requires the living back and forth of two voices, or a voice and a crowd, the question carrying forward until the answer resolves it, the resolution opening into the next question. When a lament priest in a Sumerian temple led an audience through a love song about Inanna and Dumuzi, the audience participating in the refrains was not decorating the poem, they were completing it. The poem without their voices was like a conversation with one side removed, structurally present but missing the thing that made it live. None of this changed what the poem was about. The honey man and his honey lips remained at the center of it. Inanna's preparation, her desire, her choosing, these remained the core of what was sung. The social and ritual architecture around the poetry was real and important and worth describing, but the architecture served something, and what it served was the poetry itself. The words about a man and a woman, and honey and longing, and the specific sweetness of being chosen by someone who could have chosen anything else. There is a passage in the love poetry in which Inanna describes the moment of Dumuzi's arrival, the sound of his coming before she can see him, the anticipation of the moment when distance closes into presence. The passage has the quality of attention that is given only to things that truly matter, the small sounds made large by importance, the approach of the beloved tracked through every available sense before the moment of actual reunion. It is the kind of attention that the body pays to what the heart is waiting for, and it is described in the poem with enough exactness that the quality of the waiting, that specific alertness, that sharpened readiness, can still be felt in the reading of it. That quality of presence, the alertness of someone genuinely moved by what they are describing, runs through the best of the Inanna Dumuzi love poetry, and it is part of what makes the poems surprising, even now. Ancient literature can sometimes feel distant in the specific sense of seeming to be addressed to a completely different kind of person, a person with different nerves and different concerns and a different interior life. The love poetry of Inanna and Dumuzi does not feel that way. It feels addressed to people who know what it is to wait for someone, to feel the world become sweeter in a particular presence, to reach for a word that names what the beloved's touch feels like, and land on honey, and know that is the right word. The scribal schools that preserved this poetry did so without, in most cases, any particular awareness that they were preserving it for anyone beyond the students in the room, and the gods the texts honored. A boy copying a love song about Inanna's desire for her honeyman was practicing his wedge marks. The survival of the poem was a consequence of the practice, not the intention behind it. And yet the clay held. The tablets fell into the earth in whatever circumstances caused them to end up there. The abandonment of a city, the collapse of a building, the turning of soil over buried storerooms, and the earth held them because earth and clay are the same substance in the end, and what is made of the earth has a way of returning to it without being entirely consumed. The storeroom imagery from the love poems, the grain, the cedar oil, the abundance piled inside Inanna's temple, appears in the cuneiform with the same care given to the images of desire. In the tradition the poems come from, these two kinds of fullness were understood to be connected, each dependent on the other, the goddess's love and the goddess's storerooms, part of the same divine fact about the world. When the king performed the role of Dumuzi in the sacred marriage, he was not simply enacting a love story. He was, in the theological understanding of his own tradition, participating in the renewal of the connection between divine love and earthly abundance, pressing the ceremony into the year the way a stylus presses marks into clay, making an impression that the world would hold and carry forward. The sacred marriage as a ceremony took place in the context of a specific season. The spring, in the Sumerian agricultural world, was when the land was being prepared and planted, when the waters from the melting snows to the north arrived through the rivers and the irrigation channels to fill the fields, when the pastures were at their greenest and the animals well fed, and the full abundance of the year was ahead rather than behind. The timing of the ceremony was not incidental. The sacred marriage was, among other things, a way of aligning the human world with the divine world at the moment when that alignment most needed to hold, when the land's capacity for abundance was greatest and the fear of its failure was correspondingly sharp. What was asked of Inanna in this ceremony, what was understood to be renewed between her and the figure performing Dumuzi's role, was a continuation of her love, her attention, her care, her willingness to remain in relation to the world rather than to withdraw from it. A goddess who loved was a goddess whose abundance flowed outward. A goddess whose love was honored and returned was a goddess who had reason to remain engaged with the world she presided over. The ceremony was not a transaction in the simple sense of an exchange of services. It was a renewal of a relationship, and what the relationship was understood to provide: the grain, the animals, the milk, the green of the pastures, was understood to flow from that relationship continuing to hold. Inanna's love poetry was also, therefore, a kind of argument about what the world depended on, not the labor of the farmer alone, not the correct performance of ritual alone, not the power of the king alone, but the love of a goddess for a man who was worthy of it, renewed each year in a ceremony that placed a living king in the role of the worthy beloved, asking the goddess to look at the man before her and see in him the one she had always chosen. The ceremony worked in its own theological logic because Inanna had chosen Dumuzi before any king ever stood in his place. The original choice, preserved in the love poetry, was the ground on which all subsequent ceremonies stood. The honeyman existed before the ceremony in the older, oral, prescribal memory of the tradition, and the ceremony reached back to him as its authority and its meaning. In the tradition's own telling, the love between Inanna and Dumuzi was not only private, or only ritual, or only political. It was all of these things at once, because in the world the tradition came from, these were not yet fully separate categories. The divine and the earthly were not neatly divided domains with a border between them. They were continuous, each giving form to the other, the love of the goddess visible in the fullness of the storerooms, the fullness of the storerooms reflecting the continuing attention of the goddess, the king standing in the role of the shepherd, because the shepherd had stood there first, and his love had made the role worth standing in. The tablet at Nippur that holds the phrase honeyman is small enough to rest in one palm. Its surface, after 4,000 years, is not perfectly intact. There are places where the clay has suffered, where the edge has worn, where the pressed marks are harder to read, but the core of it holds. The phrase holds. The small cluster of wedge marks that a Sumerian scribe pressed into damp clay in a school in the city that scribes called their own, the marks that mean honey and the marks that mean man, placed together in the order a love song required. Those marks are still there in the clay, still readable, still carrying the specific sweetness of what they said in the moment they were first said, by someone who reached for the right word and found it was honey. That word, honey, traveled through the scribal schools and through the temple singers and through the ceremonies of the earthly kings and through the long ages of the earth above the tablet, and through the excavations of the 19th century, and through the museum storerooms where scholars learned to read the wedge marks again, it arrived at the present moment in its original form, not translated into anything softer or more distant, but there, concrete, exact, the same syllable that a singer in ancient Uruk returned to in the refrain of a love song, because it was the truest word for what was meant. What the tradition preserved, through all the ways things are preserved, copying and reciting and pressing into clay and burying in earth, was not only the story of a god and a goddess, it was the particular quality of tenderness that existed between them, carried intact in the smallest possible form, a word for sweetness, still legible, still sweet. Inanna's feet crossed the threshold of Uruk in the hour before the city woke. The Gala moved behind her, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular patience of beings who have no reason to hurry and no capacity to be turned aside. They did not speak to the people they passed. They did not look at the walls or the market stalls, or the river light beginning to spread itself across the low rooftops of the city. They followed Inanna through the gate of Uruk, because that was the arrangement, and the arrangement would not change until it changed on its own terms. Inanna walked with the knowledge of what she had given to come back. The underworld took something from everyone who entered it. She had given 7 things at 7 gates on the way down: the reed crown, the lapis beads, the double strand at her throat, the pins at her breast, the gold band at her wrist, the measuring rod and line, the royal robe, each one surrendered to the gate and its keeper, each one a portion of herself left in the dark. She had received them back on the way up, but the law of the underworld did not allow an empty exit. The law required a substitute, and Inanna had crossed back into the world of the living with the Gala at her back and the weight of that requirement still unpaid. She had passed mourners on the road, people who had bent themselves down in grief during her absence, who had worn the garments of sorrow and sat in the dust and made their faces show what they felt. The Gala had looked at each of them and kept walking. The Gala moved past lament, because lament was a sign of the proper order: grief for the absent goddess, faithfulness expressed through mourning, the visible shape of loyalty. None of those people had been touched. None of them had been chosen. The throne room of Uruk opened before her, and there was Dumuzi. He sat on the throne she had left. He wore fine garments. His hands were at ease. His face held none of the ash and sackcloth of grief, none of the particular stillness of a man who has been sitting with an absence and letting the weight of it settle over him, the way a season settles over the land. He was dressed well. He was seated where she had sat, and the Gala behind Inanna did not need to be told anything, because what they saw told them everything. The Sumerian texts describe this moment with a precision that has not blurred across 4,000 years. Inanna looked at Dumuzi. The texts record the look. They say she fixed her eye upon him, the eye of death. That phrase is not arbitrary or decorative. In the Sumerian accounting of what had happened underground, Inanna had stood in the judgment hall of the great below and received that same gaze from Ereshkigal, her sister and the queen of the dead. The eye of death from below had killed Inanna in the underworld, and now standing in her own throne room with the Gala at her back, Inanna turned the eye of death on the figure seated in her place. The vocabulary is the same in both directions: the love gaze of the courtship poems, and the killing gaze of the underworld, and the look Inanna fixed on Dumuzi. These 3 different ways of seeing are woven through the same texts in careful opposition, each one the mirror of another, each one specific and deliberate in the words the scribes chose to press into clay. She spoke the sentence. It was short. It gave him to them. The Gala moved forward. What the Gala are, in the Sumerian understanding of how the underworld worked, matters here. They are not described in the texts as cruel figures. They are not monsters in the sense of being irregular or aberrant. The texts that describe them are careful to establish exactly what they are and what they are not, because what they are not is as important as what they are. They do not eat food. They do not drink water. They cannot be reached by the gestures of ordinary human relationship, the offered gift, the interceding prayer, the appeal to compassion. A god who tried to give them something would find the offering simply not received. A human who wept in front of them would weep in front of beings for whom weeping existed in another register entirely, one they did not speak. They are the functionaries of a law, and the law does not have feelings about its own operation. When Inanna descended to the underworld, the Gala who met her at each gate were doing what the gates required. When the Gala followed Inanna out of the underworld toward a city and a throne room, and a man in fine clothes, they were still doing what the law required. The law required a substitute. The substitute had been located. The Gala moved forward. Dumuzi ran. The texts do not frame this as surprising or as cowardice. Running, when the Gala come, is simply the thing a living person does, because living persons are the only beings in the Sumerian world who still have the full range of responses available, and running is among them. What the story carries forward from this point is not judgment on Dumuzi for running, but the specific quality and shape of his flight, the people he ran toward, and what was done on his behalf by those who loved him. He prayed to Utu. That detail is particular. Kutu, the sun god, god of justice, the one who travels the sky in his full radiance and descends at night to move through the underworld before rising again. Utu is Inanna's brother. He had endorsed the marriage. He had vouched for Dumuzi's worth and given his formal endorsement of the match, standing behind it with the weight of a divine kinsman's approval. And now Dumuzi turned to that same figure and asked for help. The prayer is preserved in the texts. Dumuzi asks Utu to transform his hands and feet. He asks to be made into something that can move across the open steppe the way the steppe requires, fast, light, low to the ground, capable of the long-running stride that the flat land between the rivers was made for. Utu answered. The transformation the sun god performed turned Dumuzi's hands and feet into those of a gazelle. A gazelle on the Mesopotamian plain moves in a way that has its own grammar, a ground-covering stride that looks effortless from a distance, the body held level while the legs do their work below, the ability to shift direction on ground that has no shelter and no feature to hide behind. Dumuzi came down from the throne room of Uruk and moved out onto the open land as something between himself and the animal, and the steppe spread before him in every direction with the horizon flat and pale and very far away. The Gala followed. What the flight describes in the dream of Dumuzi and the related texts is a series of shelters sought and lost. Dumuzi moved toward the places where he had some claim to safety or affection, the house of his friend Belili, the house of his sister Inanna. The Gala do not run. They do not need to run because they operate on a different understanding of time than a living person does. They move with the patience of something that knows the distance will close eventually, because distance and time are not for the Gala what they are for a gazelle crossing the steppe with transformed hands and feet. They simply continued. Dumuzi came to Belili's house. The texts describe this stop in a way that is quiet rather than dramatic, a place of shelter, a friend's threshold, the instinct to go where there is someone who knows one's name. Bileli is a figure associated in the tradition with love and lamentation both, which is a combination the Sumerian world held without contradiction. Dumuzi rested briefly there. The Gala came. He moved again. He came to Inanna. Inanna is Dumuzi's sister. The texts associate her with the vine, with the work of the vineyard, and with the interpretation of dreams, that specific ancient skill of reading the imagery of sleep and understanding what it means about the waking world. Before the flight fully began, before Dumuzi had yet run, the text preserve a scene in which he sat with Inanna in the early morning and told her his dream. It is one of the more specific preserved images in the whole cycle, and it carries the quality of a domestic moment that happens to contain the whole weight of what is coming. The dream Dumuzi had was this: the single standing reed of a house had been torn away. The two reeds that stood together had been bent and broken. A great tree had been uprooted. His churn had been overturned, and the milk had spilled out. His cup had fallen from its peg. His shepherd's crook had vanished. An eagle had seized a lamb. A falcon had taken a sparrow. His ewes had dragged their feet, and the goats of the fold had pushed their face into the dust. Inanna listened. She understood what it meant. She told him. The reed torn away, the tree uprooted, the cup fallen, the shepherd's crook gone. These images in the Sumerian vocabulary of dreams point toward one thing. They point toward capture, toward the taking of a person out of their ordinary world and the world's ordinary functioning. She did not soften the reading. The texts do not describe her hedging or offering a gentler interpretation out of tenderness for her brother. She told him what the dream said, because that was what the skill required, and she had the skill, and she used it. And the texts leave the impression that this directness was itself a form of love, not protection through concealment. Love through honesty, through sitting with someone in the early morning with the dream still fresh, and saying, "This is what I see." She also told him she would not give him up. When the Gala came, Inanna stood between them and her brother. She did not strike them. There was no striking the Gala. They were not the kind of beings who could be struck and made to feel it. She simply refused to tell them where Dumuzi was. The texts record the moment in plain language. The Gala asked. Inanna did not answer. They offered her things, rivers of grain, rivers of water, and she refused. The offering meant nothing to her, set against her brother, and the Gala's attempts at persuasion had the flat quality of a mechanism trying something it was not designed to succeed at. She would not give him up. Dumuzi was found anyway. He was found somewhere in the open, and the Gala took him. The taking is described in the texts without elaboration, not because it did not matter, but because the texts are not interested in dwelling there. The dwelling comes elsewhere in the cycle. The dwelling comes in the sister's grief, in the mother Surtur's lament, in the voices of the women in the streets of the city. The capture itself is brief in the texts, which gives it a particular weight of its own, the brevity that comes not from indifference, but from the way certain things cannot be made more bearable by being described at length. But the cycle does not end there. What happens after the capture is the part the tradition held most carefully, and the reason it held it was because the story needed to end somewhere that was not simply loss. Inanna came to understand Inanna's grief. The texts do not fully trace the path from the moment of condemnation to the moment of Inanna's changed understanding, but the movement is there in the record, and what it produces is clear. Inanna saw what Inanna had done, and what Inanna was willing to continue doing. She had not betrayed her brother. She had refused every offered inducement. She was weeping, The texts describe her grief in the language of the lament tradition, the same formal vocabulary used by lament priests in temple ritual, the same register that mourning priests would carry forward through centuries of Babylonian religious practice, and eventually into the lament culture documented all the way to a prophet standing in Jerusalem, watching women weep at a gate. Geshtinana's grief for Dumuzi was the most visible and persistent love in the whole cycle, and Inanna recognized it. Then Geshtinana did the thing that changed the arrangement. She offered to go, not as a negotiation, not as a transaction, not as a trade. She was proposing in order to get something else in return. The texts present it simply as what she said, that she was willing to go to the underworld in Dumuzi's place, to spend time below in the dark country, while her brother came back above into the world that had been his. The statement is made in the presence of Inanna and the Gala, and the texts give it the quality of a sentence that, once spoken, rearranges the structure of things. A stated willingness, an offered dissent, love made into a plain declaration that held the weight of everything the tradition said love was capable of producing. Inanna accepted. The arrangement she made was this: Dumuzi would not be held in the underworld forever. Geshtinana would go below for half the year, and Dumuzi would be below for the other half. Each of them would spend a portion of time in the dark country, and a portion above. They would alternate. The year would be divided between the brother and the sister, and the turning of that division would be visible in the world above, in the land, in the pastures, in the movement of flocks, in the quality of the light. The Sumerian mythological tradition understood the seasons through this arrangement, not as an explanation invented later to account for a pattern that already existed in nature, but as the living mechanism by which the pattern operated. Dumuzi's return above ground each year was the spring, the pastures greening, the air cooling into something alive after the death heat of the Mesopotamian summer, the sheep moving from their dry season shelters out into the open land. All of this was Dumuzi coming back. His descent again was the dying of the growing season, the arrival of the relentless summer heat that turned the plain to something close to burning, the withering of the pastures. And while Dumuzi was below, Geshtinana was above, and while Geshtinana was below, Dumuzi was above, and the two of them kept the year between them by the terms of what the sister had offered and Inanna had accepted. This is a different kind of resolution than the traditions that frame their seasonal myths as pure tragedy. A figure captured and held, mourned each year by those above, the grief being the explanation for the cold or the dry. The Sumerian arrangement has grief in it, certainly. The mourning of Tammuz, documented in the Babylonian religious calendar with its lament songs and its hand drums and its public weeping in the heat of the fourth month, was real and formal and serious. The women Ezekiel saw at the north gate of the Jerusalem temple, seated with their heads bowed in the summer heat, were engaged in that same mourning. The grief was genuine, the loss was real, but the loss was structured. It was not permanent. It was half the year, contained within an agreement, held in place by two willing figures who kept to the arrangement, season after season, as the terms required. What the text preserve in describing Geshtinana is something the Sumerian tradition valued and named carefully. She is the dreamer's interpreter, and the loyal sister, and the willing sacrifice, and all three of these qualities belong to a single figure who does not collapse them into one another, but holds them separately and fully. She interpreted the dream clearly because that was the honest thing. She refused the gala because that was the loving thing. She offered herself because that was also the loving thing, of a different and larger kind, and the tradition does not suggest that these are contradictory. The clarity and the loyalty and the willingness are three expressions of the same underlying orientation, and the orientation is what the tradition names love. Dumuzi is not simplified by the cycle either. He wore fine clothes when he should have been mourning. He was found on the throne when a different posture was required. He ran from the gala because running was what he had to offer, and then he prayed for transformation and received it, and then he ran some more. None of this is presented as heroic in the way hero texts present heroism, and none of it is presented as culpable in a way the tradition condemns without ambiguity. He is a figure caught between two kinds of obligation, the obligation of his own survival and the obligation of his relationship with Inanna, and the texts do not resolve that tension by making him either clean or irredeemable. He is the shepherd whose season ends and whose season comes back, and whose sister chose to share the going down so that the coming back could be part of the agreement. The gala are present throughout the flight and the capture without ever becoming anything other than what they were established to be at the beginning. They move through the myth as they move through the underworld, methodical, patient, impervious to the things that would stop an ordinary figure. They pass the mourners on the road without pausing. They follow Dumuzi across the steppe at the unhurried pace of something that does not lose interest. They accept Inanna's refusal and continue searching, because refusal is not a barrier. The law of the underworld acknowledges in the same way that it acknowledges a door. When the arrangement is made and the substitution is accepted, they return with the half year they were owed, and the record does not suggest they felt anything particular about the outcome. The law had been satisfied. That was their nature, and the story used their nature without needing to make them into something more dramatically terrible than they already were. The city of Uruk, which had mourned Inanna and then watched her return, and then watched the gala move through its streets, and then watched Dumuzi run, continued after all of this. The city continued because cities are the kind of thing that contain events and keep going, that absorb the passing of gods, and the descent and return of their shepherds, and the grief of lament, priests in the summer heat, and the arrival of the next year's spring. Uruk had been there before the myths were written down, when the words were still moving through the voices of temple singers, rather than through the pressed clay of tablets. It had been there when the tablets were being made, in the particular grain of its life, the mud brick walls, the Inanna temple raised on its platform, the river light in the mornings, the flat plain stretching away in every direction, absorbed the Dumuzi cycle as it absorbed everything else, as a place absorbs the particular quality of what has happened there and carries it forward in the texture of the ordinary. The scribes of the earthly period who wrote these poems down were working in schools that treated love songs as appropriate material for practicing the difficult skill of cuneiform inscription. A student in Nippur, pressing the wedge marks for honey and lips and beloved and the name of the shepherd, was practicing a technical skill and also pressing into clay something that would outlast the school, the city, the dynasty, and the river course as it existed in that century. The tablet was not made to survive. It was made to practice on. The survival came afterward, unbidden, from the particular quality of fired clay and dry desert soil, and the patience of excavators working with fine brushes in southern Iraq in the last decade of the 19th century, and then from the patience of a scholar in the 20th century, traveling between museums in Philadelphia and Istanbul and Chicago, holding fragment against fragment until the broken edges fit and a line of poetry no one had read in millennia completed itself in a museum storeroom with the light coming in from a high window. That quality of patience, the scribe's careful hand, the scholar's careful eye, the agreement between a sister and a brother, maintained across 6 months, and then again across the next 6 months, and then again, has something in it that the Sumerian tradition understood as the mechanism of the world. Things continue because something maintains them. Seasons turn because an arrangement holds. Love survives as long as someone is willing to make the descent, and willing to make it again the following year, and willing to let the brother come back, because the coming back is part of what was agreed. The myth does not end with a resolution in the sense of a knot being untied. It ends with a rhythm established. Dumuzi below, Inanna above. Then Dumuzi above, Inanna below. The movement is the resolution, not a fixed final state, but a continuing alternation, the kind of ending that is actually a pattern, recurring, reliable, visible in the landscape every year, in the form of green pastures arriving and then fading and then arriving again. Inanna, at the end of the cycle, has accomplished something the texts frame carefully. She descended and returned. She condemned her husband and then participated in the arrangement that preserved him in half measure. She accepted Inanna's offer and made it the structural basis of the year. The tradition does not explain every movement of Inanna's interior. Her grief when she lost Dumuzi to the Gala she had called, her understanding of Inanna's love, the particular weight of a goddess who carries the me of descent into the underworld as one of her fundamental divine attributes, and has now used that attribute twice, first for herself and then as the destination for the two figures who love each other most in the whole cycle. The texts hold these things without exhausting them, which is why they have continued to be read. The lament priests who sang the Dumuzi texts in Babylonian temples were performing a function that the tradition understood as cosmologically necessary. The mourning was not merely expressive, it was in the Mesopotamian understanding, part of the mechanism that allowed the seasonal pattern to operate. The grief that accompanied Dumuzi's descent was woven into the fabric of the passage itself, and singing the lament in the heat of the 4th month was a way of participating in the structure of what was happening to the land. The women in the streets with their hand drums and their lament songs were not simply feeling a feeling and expressing it. They were doing something the cosmology required, holding up their part of the arrangement by mourning in the right way at the right time, as Inanna had mourned, and as the tradition said, mourning worked. This is why the image at the very end of the cycle, the spring arrival, the pastures greening, Dumuzi returning above ground into the cool air of the season that follows the heat, is not described in the texts as triumphant. It is described as quiet, a return, a seasonal fact, the flocks moving out from wherever they sheltered during the dry months, the grass coming back in the flat land between the rivers, the shepherd's crook back in the shepherd's hand, the morning light, the particular quality of morning light in a world that is, for the moment, between one kind of heat and another,